Welcome back. 2 times, in 2016 and 2020, Bernie Sanders ran for president as an unapologetic progressive, seeking vast increases in government social spending. Both times he lost the Democratic nomination to perceived to be more cautious centrist candidates, Hillary Clinton in 2016, Joe Biden last year. But with President Biden's proposals for vast new spending, it's fair to ask, did Senator Sanders lose the battles but win the party's war of ideas? Well, Bernie Sanders joins me now. Senator Sanders, I saw you smirk there when I did that little tease about that. So go ahead and answer the question. Do you feel as if, when you look at your 2 campaigns, yes, you're not president, but do you feel as if you won the war of ideas inside your party?
Well, it's not just me. I think what you saw is millions of people standing up, grassroots activists standing up and saying, you know what? At a time of massive income and wealth inequality, maybe, and Chuck, this is a radical idea, but maybe, just maybe, government should represent the needs of a struggling working class and middle class, and not just the 1% and wealthy campaign contributors. And I think all over this country, people said, look, there are massive problems exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think President Biden looked around and he said, you know what? We've got to address those problems, not worry about the rich and the powerful. So we are beginning to make some progress in dealing with issues that have been neglected for decades.
I'm curious, your focus, when it comes to seeing these plans get passed, how important is the pay-for part of this conversation? How much of this, in your mind, is you're willing, deficit spending, these are investments, you'll get return, and how important do you think it is that you reform the tax code and use that to pay for this?
Well, I think, number one, most importantly, we have to deal with the crises facing this country. We have massive income and wealth inequality. Half our people live on paycheck to paycheck. We've got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. You've got to do that. We have an infrastructure that is collapsing. We have got to address the existential threat of climate change. And when you do that, Chuck, when you make those investments, we create millions of good-paying jobs. We are the only major country not to guarantee health care to all people as a right, the only major country not to have paid family and medical leave. We pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. Hundreds of thousands of kids can't afford to go to college, and millions leave school deeply in debt. Well, you know what? You got to address those issues. Meanwhile, you got 2 people on top who own more wealth than the bottom 40% of America. You got major corporation after major corporation not paying 1 nickel in federal income tax. Warren Buffett, one of the richest guys in the world, reminds us that the effective tax rate for working families is higher than it is for the billionaire class. So in terms of pay for, yeah, I do think we need progressive taxation, which says to the very rich, Biden says the cap should be, the floor should be 400,000. Yeah. Nobody under that should pay more in taxes. But yes, the very rich and large corporations should start paying their fair share of taxes to help us rebuild America and create the jobs that we need.
If you have to make the choice, because some of your Democratic Senate colleagues seem to have a little bit of nervousness about voting for some of these tax increases, but they will vote for the spending. Will you take the spending if it doesn't come with the tax increases?
Well, the devil is in the details, obviously. But I think what has got to happen is we have got to begin addressing the enormous crises facing this country. And that is what I think the president is trying to do. I think once we start discussing these issues in the Congress, there will be differences of opinion. But I think there is a consensus, at least within the Democratic caucus, that now is the time to start protecting working families and the middle class, and not just the 1%.
One of the things not included in the president's plan was some things that you wanted to see, including lowering the eligibility age to Medicare, in particular being the biggest one there. And I want to ask you about it in conjunction with this statement that James Carville made, and I want to bring it up here. It has to do with Joe Manchin. He says, the Democratic Party can't be more liberal than Senator Joe Manchin. That's the fact. We don't have the votes. And I bring this up because Senator Manchin has said he's not in favor of lowering that eligibility age. Do you think that was probably why Joe Biden didn't include your provision in his plan?
No, I don't think so. James Carville can live in his world. I don't think he's terribly relevant to what happens in Congress right now. Here is the story, very simple story, is that right now, for the last 55 years, since Medicare was developed in 1965, it has not included coverage for dental care, hearing aids, and eyeglasses. And I can tell you, in Vermont and all over this country, you got senior citizens whose teeth are rotting in their mouths, older people who can't talk to their grandchildren because they can't hear them because they can't afford a hearing aid, and people who can't read a newspaper because they can't afford glasses. So to say that dental care and hearing aids and eyeglasses should be a part of Medicare makes all the sense in the world. Second of all, we're going to pay for this. This is a pay for. Right now, as I think every American understands, we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. We're getting ripped off every day by the pharmaceutical industry, who in some cases charges us 10 times more for the same drug that's sold in Canada or in other countries. So what we want to do is what the American people want to do. We want to negotiate prescription drug prices with the industry through Medicare. When you do that, you save about $500 billion, and that can cover the cost of dental care, eyeglasses, and hearing aid under Medicare, as well as lowering the eligibility age to 60. That's what we have to do. We have a pay for that.
But before I let you go, we have, obviously, the virus is pretty out of control in India. It's not in good shape in Brazil. These are two pretty big countries that could have an impact on us, both our health and our economy. Our vaccine distribution, we have a lot here. Should we start sharing it faster than we are now, particularly when you see what's going on in our hemisphere and in India? Should we be more aggressive here? It seems like we've been a bit, some might argue, overly cautious about our vaccine supply.
Well, I think a couple of things, Chuck. The answer is yes. I think we've got to obviously make sure that every American gets vaccinated as quickly as possible. But I do think not only do we have a moral responsibility to help the rest of the world, it's in our own self-interest. Because if this pandemic continues to spread in other countries, it's going to come back and bite us at one point or another. But the second thing we should do is not only make sure that excess vaccines in the United States get around to countries that need it, we should deal with this issue through the World Trade Organization of protecting the intellectual property rights of the drug companies. And I think what we have got to say right now to the drug companies, when millions of lives are at stake around the world, yes, allow other countries to have these intellectual property rights so that they can produce the vaccines that are desperately needed in poor countries. There is something morally objectionable about rich countries being able to get that vaccine, and yet millions and billions of people in poor countries are unable to afford it.
Glad you brought up the intellectual property rights issue, because that is something we want to get manufacturing started as soon as possible in some of these remote areas. Anyway, Senator Bernie Sanders, the progressive independent from Vermont, thanks for coming on and sharing your perspective.
Thank you very much.
When we come back, President Biden has decided to go. Welcome back. Panel is with us. It's NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Casey Hunt, Michelle Sindor, the White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, former Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill of Missouri, and Lonnie Chen, a fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Claire, I want to start with you. Some of your former colleagues are I think, getting a little nervous about some of these tax increases, and you're seeing more openness to, you don't have to pay for all of it. Where is this realistically heading? Are we going for probably half of what's been proposed on the tax increases at the end of the day, and a little more deficit spending?
Probably. I mean, what Chuck Schumer has to do is he has to work through many senators. It's not just Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. There are other senators that are concerned about competitiveness and making sure that we target these tax increases for the people who aren't paying their fair share. Will it be 28 in terms of a corporate rate? Maybe 25, maybe 26, maybe 27. Will everything on the wish list get through? No, probably not. But at the end of the day, Chuck Schumer is going to work through those senators and try to get them all to agree. And then once he gets close to 50, like 49 and a half, then he starts working on the Republicans to get it across the finish line.
It's interesting. It was notable that Janet Yellen she mentioned the specific percentage rates of some tax increases they're proposing, but not the corporate tax increase, which I think was notable. Lonnie, There seems to be, though, Rich Lowry made this point earlier this week. There's no Tea Party. It doesn't seem as if this version of the Republican Party is as allergic to the debt, frankly, as the version of the Republican Party that Rob Portman grew up in.
Yeah, well, look, the Republican Party should feel like they need to make a case on the value of fiscal responsibility. That is something that I think is an important case to be made. And if you look at the proposals that the president's put forward, what is clear is that, I think the public, as your polling shows, does want the government to do more, but they also want the government to live in some ways within its means. So there is a significant amount of support, for example, for a skinny down package that focuses on transportation infrastructure and water infrastructure, somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 billion. That's a much more responsible approach than the several $trillion-dollar jobs plan that the president's put forward. So I think the Republicans need to make the case on why it is that it's important to have packages that address the need, but also do so in a responsible way. Look, in the long run, actually, independent estimates suggest the president's jobs plan shrinks the size of the economy over the long run. So these are the kinds of points Republicans need to be making as they debate these issues.
Casey, look, this is your beat. It seems like Republicans and even Joe Manchin and some other Democrats want to do this more piecemeal. Is this where we're headed? Are we going to see a series of the physical infrastructure bills, and that's what happens, and then we'll find out whatever's left at the end of the summer, and then Democrats decide what to do?
I do think that's a possibility, Chuck. I don't think that it's been firmly decided. And as I was listening to Senator Portman earlier in the broadcast, I thought he sounded more optimistic than I might have expected him to, more open to potentially doing something like that. And I do think if they are going to pass something that has Republican votes, it's likely not going to be everything that President Biden wants. And I think there are a lot of Democrats who are assuming that they are, at the end of the day, going to have to go it alone, especially, frankly, if they want to pay for it. So, that I think you've hit on exactly the right tension here. There are no Republicans who are interested in raising these taxes the way Democrats are talking about. But there is some nervousness among especially some of the more pro-business Democrats who, frankly, are afraid to step out and do that in public because of exactly what Bernie Sanders outlined, Senator Sanders outlined in your conversation with him. So that's going to be a behind-the-scenes dynamic that I think is really going to drive a lot of this.
Yamiche, I am curious. Progressives are getting a lot of what they want, but they're not happy about the health care provisions. Are they so unhappy it would muddy up everything else? Or is this one of the things that they may rhetorically complain about, but accept it if nothing else changes?
I think that that's a big question that needs to be answered. Right now, it sounds as though progressives are definitely wanting to push, at least, to try to get Medicare for all, to try to get some of the Medicare changes that Senator Bernie Sanders was just outlining for you. But overall, when you talk to progressive lawmakers, they are largely happy with what they're seeing from this Biden administration. You have people like Larry Cohen saying his staffing wouldn't have been any better if it was Bernie Sanders as president. You have progressives saying that, yes, we want to see a bit more, and it's our job to push him. But in fact, we are getting a lot of what we want. $6 trillion in spending. If you add up all of the Biden plans right now, that's a lot of money. And the Biden administration is really leaning in on the idea that they can expand the idea of bipartisanship to include all of those Republicans who want to see money for their cities. And they want to see it go past just roads and bridges to impact people's lives, like home health care workers, community college, all of the different things that the Biden administration is proposing. I think it's going to be a big challenge to get Republicans to go on, because the 2017 tax cuts were really their signature thing that they want to keep aboard and want to keep really there.
That's why I smell deficit spending coming in a big way. Hey, I want to quickly play a comment from Senator Scott and the Republican response and get you guys to react on the other side. Here it is.
Today, kids are being taught that the color of their skin defines them again. And if they look a certain way, they're an oppressor. Hear me clearly. America is not a racist country.
Yamiche and Casey, this sparked a huge debate among quite a few folks about the role of race in the history of America. Here's my curiosity, Yamiche. Did his comments put bipartisan police reform at risk?
I don't think so, talking to sources, because if you saw the day after, President Biden as well as Vice President Harris echoed that, saying they don't believe America is a racist country. They did, though, say something that Senator Scott did not say, which is that there are consequences to slavery that have completely embedded themselves in American society, from healthcare to education to how the coronavirus pandemic exposed and exploited real inequalities in our country. But I think talking to lawmakers and talking to the White House, there is this inflection point after Derek Chauvin being found guilty of murdering George Floyd that feels like lawmakers will be able to get some sort of bill at least negotiated and get far in those discussions. So I don't think this specific comment from Senator Scott is going to upend that. And I think Democrats are really trying to lean in to say, what can we get done on this specific issue? Because it is so, of course, really all encompassing when you look at how policing and African Americans are dealing in this country.
Casey, yeah, very quickly. I mean, I'm hesitant, Lucy, in the football, Charlie Brown, and you name it, but the amount of optimism there is about a bipartisan police reform deal coming to fruition, are you that optimistic?
I am actually optimistic, Chuck. Republicans have a very strong messenger in Tim Scott. They're lucky to have him. They trust him. I think if it's going to happen, you're going to see the vast majority of Republicans go with it. It's not going to be Tim Scott and nine other Republicans. So I do think right now, today, it's possible. All
right. When we come back, so you think you know who the political winners and losers are with the next census? Well, think again. That's next. Welcome back. Data download time. The census figures came out this week, and it impacts not just the balance of power in Congress, but it obviously shifts votes in the Electoral College. So let's first look at the impact on the presidential election. With the new data, electoral votes changed in 13 states, and states that Democrats have traditionally counted on, and particularly in the Northeast, New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois, and California, each lost a vote. By the way, for California, first time they have ever lost a seat due to the census. And a number of states where Republicans have done well in recent years, Texas, North Carolina, Florida, and yes, Montana, all gained a vote. Texas, by the way, the only state to add more than one vote to their Electoral College total. So at first glance, it does seem as if Republicans benefit, and they certainly will gain congressional seats in the short run. But these states have been changing over the last 50 years, and they continue to. So it's too soon to know the impact on the next decade of presidential elections. You just have to look back to Georgia to remember that, right? In fact, we looked at the biggest shifts going back to 1970, and there is a pretty clear pattern. No surprise, the U.S. population has been moving south and west over the past 50 years. New York is the big loser. It's down 13 seats in 50 years, while Texas gained 14, Florida 13. In fact, not one of the biggest loser states is west of the Mississippi or south of the Mason-Dixon line. But the political impact can be a little harder to predict. Of the 10 states that have seen the biggest population changes since 1970, 4 have looked more purple in the last presidential elections. We're talking, of course, about Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Not to mention the presidential election margin in Texas continues to shrink each cycle. And then, of course, Florida is always going to Florida on us. Now, remember this. The South was once solidly Democratic. New England was Republican territory. So what looks to be an advantage for one party now may look like a disadvantage in just a short 10 years. When we come back, welcome back. I want to take a look at how the heart and soul of the Republican Party has shifted far away from Washington. In fact, during President Biden's first 100 days, it's pretty clear the heart of the GOP is in the state houses. Here's what's happened in these first 100 days. Republican-controlled legislatures in 8 states so far have passed laws that are restricting voter access, including tighter limits on absentee ballots in some places. At the same time, similar bills have been introduced in 39 other states. We don't know the results of those yet. Then there's been some crackdown on protesters. 5 states already have passed bills that limit the rights of protesters. Florida, for instance, actually passed a law that would grant legal immunity to somebody who drove through protesters blocking a road. By the way, 27 other states have already had bills introduced that would also crack down on protests. We don't know those results yet. Next up, there's been a lot more looser gun laws. 19 states so far this year have passed new laws that loosen gun restrictions, including Tennessee, which now will allow people to carry handguns without seeking a permit. In fact, so far, every state in the country has had bills introduced that would do one thing on the gun issue: loosen restrictions. And then finally, 7 states have passed laws that would prevent transgender youth from participating in student athletics. And we know that similar bills have been introduced in another 26 states. We don't know where that's going. But Lonnie Chen, when you look at we've been looking at the first 100 days of Joe Biden. This is the first 100 days of the Republican Party. What are you learning from it? Because if the states are the laboratories for democracy, what does this say about the future of the GOP?
Well, look, I think cultural politics have always been part of the Republican Party, but just as you've got those examples, you've got a number of Republican governors who aren't focused on these sorts of things. You think about Larry Hogan and Charlie Baker and Mike DeWine and Phil Scott, a series of governors who are focused on governing and really the longer run vision of what the Republican Party needs to do to be successful in urban areas and suburbs and places like California, where I live. Because look, a lot of the Republican Party now, the dialogue does seem to be around what the kids call owning the libs. But in the long run, I think that's probably not what's going to make the Republican Party successful. And I think the examples set out by people like Baker and Hogan and others, those are going to be the kinds of things that will make the Republican Party a successful governing coalition nationally again. And that's really what I look for.
Well, you sound, I think, a bit, some might say, overly optimistic. Claire McCaskill, you saw this transformation in the GOP, frankly, arguably a decade earlier in Missouri. Where's this headed? Where do you think this is going in other states?
I have to believe it's not good for the Republican Party because they have become simply the party of grievance. It is all about culture wars. It's not about the budget. It's about the border. It's about playing to people's fears and making that the centerpiece of who they are as a party. And I got to tell you, I think local journalism and the demise of it has played a role in this, Chuck. It is very difficult to get a lot of good information about some of the nutballs that are in state legislatures right now because there are so few local journalists left. That is another problem we're going to have to tackle if we want to get back to some kind of normalcy in these state capitals.
Yeah, even in the state of Florida, the state's largest newspaper has to share a Capitol bureau. I mean, it is absurd. Yamiche, I guess the question is, do Democrats say, all right, you want to have a culture war, GOP, let's go? Or do they have asymmetrical fight back, meaning focus on kitchen table issues?
Based on my conversations with White House officials and Democratic lawmakers, they're trying to lean in on the idea that they can deliver things to the American people, services, policies that will impact their lives and better their lives, rather than getting involved in the culture wars that the Republican Party is so focused on. You can see in Republicans that they are really leaning in on strategies that helped President Trump win in 2016, but failed in 2020. These are laws including the voting rights or protesting or the transgender laws. They're all trying to solve problems that largely don't exist on a large scale. Most protests, 96% of them were peaceful. There is no large voter fraud, but this is where Republicans are trying to have their energy be, because they are trying to scare their voters in some ways to the polls.
Hi, Casey Hunt, I want to quick, speaking of the culture wars, Kevin Brady was on Meet the Press Daily with me on Friday. I'm not going to play the clip because we're short on time. I asked him 3 times to give Liz Cheney a vote of confidence, and he didn't do it. He's a retiring former committee chair. This is not somebody from the sort of far-right fringe of the GOP. How much trouble is Liz Cheney in?
I watched that interview, Chuck, and it struck me for sure. And I do think that there's a reason why Liz Cheney recently didn't really rule out the possibility she may run for president, because she may be losing support in the House of Representatives. I think there are a lot of people who are with her behind the scenes, but they're concerned that the public version of it will jeopardize their ability to take back the majority. And that's really where the tension is.
We shall see if she can make it through the month, let alone the rest of her term. That's all we have for today. Thank you all for watching. We'll be back next week for Mother's Day, because if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press.
Press with Chuck Todd.
And a good Sunday morning. In his 1981 inaugural address, President Ronald Reagan captured the nation's growing frustration with big government.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
15 years later, in 1996, a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, admitted the defeat of activist government.
The era of big government is over.
Then this past Wednesday, in his speech to Congress, President Joe Biden tried to put a stake in both of those ideas, declaring that the era of big government being over is now over. In the process, Mr. Biden also made clear that the idea that he intends to be a transitional president, well, that's also over too. he intends to be a transformational one. The president's goals are ambitious, far-reaching, and yes, expensive. Will voters care about the scope of Mr. Biden's plans? Well, here's one clue. 55% of adults in our new NBC News poll say the government should do more to solve our problems, versus 41% who say the government is doing too much. How about, will voters care about the price tag? Possibly. But President Trump and the Republicans may have made it a bit easier for Mr. Biden by spending big themselves, cutting taxes for the wealthy and running up the deficit on their watch. So Mr. Biden is making a $6 trillion bet that promoting popular programs will be popular, and that he'll be rewarded for getting things done long before the actual bill comes due.
I don't have any inordinate faith in government, but there's certain things only the government can do.
President Biden making the case for the largest expansion of government programs in decades.
These are investments we made together as one country, and investments that only the government was in a position to make.
It's a reimagining of the role of government in American life, extending an argument made by Barack Obama, but never fully implemented given his political constraints.
We have never been a people who place all of our faith in government to solve our problems. We shouldn't want to. But we don't think the government is the source of all our problems either.
It gained momentum during a Democratic primary campaign that pushed the party to the left.
I get a little bit tired of Democrats afraid of big ideas.
The $1.8 trillion American Families Plan proposes universal pre-K, 2 years of tuition-free community college, and expanded paid family and medical leave. It comes on top of a $2.2 trillion infrastructure proposal and after a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package. To pay for some of these initiatives, White House officials are proposing tax increases on corporations and the wealthiest Americans.
The American Family Plan does 4 things, and we pay for it all. 1, without raising the deficit.
Biden is betting Americans are open to an activist government. 82% of Democrats, 60% of independents, and even a quarter of Republicans say government should do more to solve the country's problems. It's the opening of what is likely to be a summer slugfest.
There is no such thing as a free lunch.
Think about how much money he is spending.
He doesn't want to talk about how it's going to get paid for.
If I ever hear that Joe Biden's a moderate again, I'm going to throw up.
Republicans, now concerned about deficits, argued Donald Trump's 2017 tax cuts would pay for themselves.
I worry about deficits, but you're not going to get out of this problem until you grow the economy.
I'm totally convinced this is a revenue neutral bill, actually a revenue producer.
It wasn't, and the deficit grew substantially. Now some Senate Democrats are already hinting at deficit spending. Hawaii's Brian Schatz telling Axios, "I'm not a big pay-for guy." Connecticut's Chris Murphy, quote, "I don't know that it needs to be fully paid for." And Montana's John Tester, "I think we should find a way to pay for half of it up front." To get his plans through Congress, Biden needs to get centrist Democrats on board.
It's a lot. I mean, we're talking trillions and trillions of dollars we need to pay for. We do.
And the president has to hold progressives who are defying the White House and pursuing a massive expansion of Medicare after a health care overhaul was left out of Biden's plans.
I just think it's the wrong approach. We need to take on those lobbyists and big pharma companies that are so willing to pour millions into defeating any kind of reform.
And joining me now is the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. Secretary Yellen, welcome to Meet the Press.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, let me start with what is on a lot of folks' minds, at least in Washington, which is simply how do you pay for it? And so I know that you guys have a plan. So put it in layman's terms here, Secretary Yellen, how you believe the administration, what you guys believe is the best way to pay for these plans.
Well, first of all, we think the plans are extremely important and necessary to invest in our economy so that we can be competitive and have families and children succeed, invest in infrastructure, in R&D, and the things that shore up middle-class prosperity, education, child care, and health care. And we've proposed to pay for these 2 packages by raising the tax rate on corporations, above its current level of 21%, but keeping it under the level it was for decades at 35%, and to close loopholes that incent American corporations to shift their income abroad to tax havens on a basis. So I believe that we should pay for these historic investments. There will be a big return. I expect productivity to rise. There will be great returns from investing in research and development and enabling families to participate with paid leave and child care support in the workforce. So I think it's true that a stronger economy will generate more tax revenues, but I think the safest thing is to pay for them, and we're doing it in a way that's fair. I should also mention that an important way of paying for this is increasing tax compliance. It's estimated that underpayment of taxes that are really due is costing us, the federal government, about $7 trillion over a decade, and there's an important proposal here to increase compliance, to fund the IRS so that, and this is a matter of fairness, to increase and collect the tax revenue that's due under our tax code.
Look, there's some concerns that all of this spending is going to lead to inflation issues. And I know right now the current inflation is arguably more of a supply chain issue right now than anything else. But how do we avoid what happened in the 70s with inflation, where basically a bunch of spending for 20 and 30 years got to us a point where we suddenly were in an inflation spiral? How is it that the same thing won't happen again over the next 20 years?
So the spending that's been proposed in the jobs plan and the families plan, it comes into effect once the economy is back on track, and the spending from the rescue plan that's coming into force and helping us get on track after that stimulus is spent. It's spread out quite evenly over 8 to 10 years, so the boost to demand is moderate. And the Federal Reserve has the tools to address inflation should it arise. We will monitor that very carefully. We're proposing that the spending be paid for. And I don't believe that inflation will be an issue, but if it becomes an issue, we have tools to address it. These are historic investments that we need to make our economy productive and fair.
Secretary Yellen, it's always a lot to get to and explain when it comes to monetary policy, how we pay for things and all of this. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck.